Hi, and welcome to Academic Compliance Academy. In this video, I'm gonna talk about the extent of compliance, or the scope of your compliance commitment, because that's really what it's about. Before we can go in and regard the actual compliance commitment, we need to take a step back and see, okay, what factors will be contributing to the requirements, the expectations of your compliance commitment. We will go into the core values and strategy of an entity or state, the value chain, the impact and size, which of course always matters, reputation, branding, and in the end, responsibility, because that is where it's all wrapping up. So before we can talk about being compliant with anything, we need to know who we are. So we need to just take up the mirror and say, okay, so who am I? Who are we? What are we going to, how are we supposed to comply? To know yourself and to know your core values and your strategy, your aim, that is the first step in determining your compliance commitment and thereby also your compliance strategy. So you might be a small business, you might be a large corporation, you might even be a state or a state within a unionized or federation, or like an assembly of states that puts other requirements for you. But no matter what you are, entity, state, even a person, you have some core values and principles that define your entity. So this could be, for a small business, could be that, okay, we're here to support the local initiative on getting greens to everyone. It might be very, very concrete that, like, this is our aim, this is our core value in life, this is our business operation. This was what was in the original intent with our business. It might also just be wealth. So even though there's a lot of negativity around businesses that primarily deal with wealth management, it's a fair enough goal. It's a fair enough core value principle. The typical problems arise when you mix your wealth principle or goal, core value, with something that is different, like a green agenda. And then you don't really focus a lot on the green agenda. So you need to be really aware of your core principles, core values. This is also relevant when we talk about states, because even though member states, of course, is just nations are a much more complex setup than just one business, which can be complex enough. You need to know your core values and know what is it that you're putting out there, which policies and on which foundation are we built. That, of course, can be sometimes easy if you look back and have a legal background, because you know that you have a constitutional foundation in most of the European countries, and on top of that we can put in the EU regulations, so we do know some core values and principles that are there. So that is like knowing who you are, what is the intention, why did you create this business, why are we together in this union, what is the aim? Then we have the strategy. So how do we get there? What are we putting out? What is our strategy now? What are we saying we're going to do? How are we going to address it? How, while still staying in compliance with our core values? Because sometimes, usually the strategy is just the way forward based on the core values and the principles. How will we address certain issues? What is the focus of the entity or state at this moment? So you might have like lowering carbon footprints, maintaining integrity in certain investments. That's where you can have wealth managers go a bit wrong if integrity suddenly get questioned by certain more shady investment schemes. You could also have like an active fight against corruption where you as a state go in and really put like forward an effort. What's funny in this sense is that you need to assess who you are. You need to assess your core values, your principles, and your strategy. It's much easier for a company to do so than a state, because states have a much higher political engagement and it might differ from year to year, where the companies typically has an agenda. They have an agenda, and it's easier to define these elements. And when I say easy, I know it's not easy, but it's easier because the complexity level is far lower with entities, companies, than with states. So when we know who we are, when we know our core values, when we know our principles, we know the strategy. So where are we going right now? When we have that baseline, that is when we can start looking at our compliance commitment. So, second part is, okay, we know our entity. So who are we cooperating with? That's the next step. Our value chain, our supply chain. How far are we to extend our compliance commitments throughout the value chain? Well, it depends, which is usually a very, very good response. It depends on your commitment, on your core values, on your strategy. If you, as a company, go out with the high branding, or your strategy is to like really have a green agenda, no carbon footprints, really going all the way, then the stronger your commitment, the stronger you're saying, the stronger your strategy is, well, the larger notice you have to put on your compliance commitment, because you have to secure that all your suppliers are in line with that strategy, because you do not have the ability to control everyone all the time. So that's why I've said here, so what about suppliers and buyers? Well, you need to assess the level of information that is available, and also the level of information that is not available. Can we say that the asymmetrical information which is not available for us is acceptable because some of the information is not needed, or the risks of being exposed to something that contradicts our core values, principles, or strategy is very, very low. So we're willing to take that risk because we don't have the resources to lower the asymmetrical information or just clear it out all at once. Some of the questions I'm just gonna put out here is just some that are fundamentally there's not a clear answer on it yet, but I just had a question in my mind that comes from the real world. If we look at a state and not a company, so could you be a neutral state in terms of picking sides in political agendas, wars, and etc., and at the same time be a primary weapon supplier? Well, in terms of old school compliance, the reactive form of compliance, which was mainly based on regulatory compliance, the answer would be yes, because there would be no laws against it. The problem comes when it's into this new area where everything is risk-based, and we have to consider the world as a dynamic, fluid, consistent, just a fluid mass. Then this is gonna be a problem. And we've seen states that proclaim themselves as neutral in any war and still have a very, very large production of weapons for each side. Well, that's not being neutral. That's capitalizing on other states' losses. So there's no problem in it if you disclose your own actions. So you can say we are a neutral state, but we do know that we supply weapons, but we try to, and then you have to have an argument. The argumentation here would be very hard because there's really no way around it. An example of knowledge, this asymmetrical information, we can take from the anti-money laundering regime, where you automatically, by regulation, you are responsible if you're knowledgeable, and you have to do a risk assessment. This does not mean that if you don't know anything, you're not responsible. You need to be sure that what you're not knowing has a low risk, and you have actively said, like, take a stand that we don't need to know the detailed level below this because the risks are so low, so we need our resources to be somewhere else. That is a part. So we have the core values, the strategy, who are you? Then the next step is looking at, so who are we dealing with? So are there compliance? Is there an alignment in our supply chain, our value chain, from suppliers to customers? Giving that field, the next step is going beyond that, so into society. And that is when we talk impact and size. Because you might be a small operation with the clear core values, your supply chain is perfect, and that also limits your compliance commitment because typically your impact would not be that big in terms of in terms of the scale into society. So depending on your size, your compliance commitment will have to be lower or higher. Size does matter. And we can see just an example on this from the regulatory, the old school compliance, is that we do have vast more regulation towards large companies because their impact on society is greater than small companies. And therefore we must control in case of this, like some market failure, then we must control it. And that's back to why do we regulate? So, but of course, if there's multiple small startups, multiple small entities, the combination of them having the same behavior might also accumulate a large impact, and hence we must regulate upon that. And that's also really, that will affect the compliance commitment. For states, it's the same. There are a higher expectations for Germany in the European Union than for Belgium, because Germany has a larger impact on the whole union. So our expectations are larger. So smaller countries have lower expectations, but they also need a smaller degree of compliance in terms of ratifying and securing everything throughout the value chain. So size does matter because the impact factor is. I just made this model here where I try to put them in, not without the value chain, because the value chain will be more like horizontal, but it will be a part of the impact factor. So I put in core values in the middle. You need to align the core values with your operations as an entity. That look at, okay, so what is my impact range? Am I just a local store, not going that far, having one supplier and buyers in the end, small supply chain, not a lot to control? Then my compliance commitment should be lower because I don't have this large an impact. At the same time, if you're a larger company, entity, state, and your impact range is larger, then you need to scale up your compliance commitment to align with this whole, with the core values, entities, and the impact factor in society. So this is pretty much what I'm just gonna and it like mix everything together in the last together here last. So we have the core values and the strategy that has to align with the value chain that will reflect on the impact factor, and those three together will at some point reflect the norm and the expectation that society will have upon your entity. So if you create that alignment, you need to know how far should I go with my compliance commitment, and that depends on who you are, what's your strategy, who are you collaborating with, what's your impact factor. Then you can trying to estimate the actual expectation and the social norm on your compliance commitment, and that is what you should do. Of course, branding, disclosure of your branding can have a large impact too. So there's also something about your own behavior, because of course, if you go out, one thing is that a principle might be in your strategy or your core values that you have on your website, like trying to broadcast it. But if you go out intensely branding something that by your operations is not 100% clear that that's what you're doing, then the problem will also arise. So of course, branding, the whole idea of enhancing some of your qualities, core values, strategy, you need to have that alignment secured before you go out, because otherwise the shitstorms can happen. And one of my favorite examples that we've seen the last couple of years, that companies tend to like have lowered their branding on this point. But when the UN Global Compact started, there was a lot of like fight against corruption, poverty, everything. And one of the clear phrases in company strategies and also member states were like, they put in this zero tolerance commitment. And I questioned that from the beginning, because that's a major compliance commitment. So you put in your strategy, say, okay, my core aim is not just to fight corruption, it is zero tolerance against corruption. That's how I'm gonna address this. Then you put your compliance commitments through the roof, because you need to secure zero corruption. Anyone working in the world will know that nothing is zero. You don't have a risk that is equals to zero. So this is an impossible compliance commitment. But it's just an example that what you put out there in your strategy, core aim, have to align with your operations. So core values, strategy, look at your operations, look at your supply chains in your operational scheme, and that has to comply with the impact factor. So what is our impact factor in society? Because then you will know how much should I put into my compliance commitment. But everything goes back to who you are and your core values. Are you branding yourself like zero tolerance? You will lose, because you will never be compliant with such a statement. So in the end, the extent of a compliance commitment equals the level of impact, value chain, core values, and social responsibilities. Everything put into one. You need to make this alignment, because your compliance commitment and how far you should go in your investment and your resource allocation depends on this exercise on going through the whole scheme. And then you can argue when you've done enough, or when you're in balance of your compliance commitment. So yes, compliance is a lot, but there's also room for saying no here, because when you know your core values, when you go through this whole process of aligning all the different levels, you will also be able to take steps away from certain areas where you do not need to use your resources in terms of your compliance commitment. So that was it for the extent of compliance commitment. Stay tuned, follow this channel, and let's continue talking more about compliance.